I think I should say at the beginning that, like, as is justified by the title, that this is a work in progress. It's called Toward a Marxian Reading, not a Marxian reading. And I've said Marxian as opposed to Marxist. So in my vocabulary, I'm not sure where I picked this up, but Marxian means the views of Karl Marx, and Marxist refers to the tradition as a whole. So I'm very much focused on Marx, and mostly early Marx. Okay, so we've got a couple of notes about Sellars, and then I'll sort of get into why I think this is interesting as a paper. So Sellars obviously, famously in Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, distinguishes between the manifest and the scientific images. But he also has what he calls the original image and his proposed stereoscopic image. So the original image, right, is, as I understand it, the kind of image of the world and our place in the world that is proper to a pre-scientific culture. It's the kind of image of how we fit in the world that has very little to do with scientific knowledge and lots to do with things like narratives or myths. Then the manifest image, right, which is scientific humanity's image of itself, but not when it's doing science, I think. So it has been molded, right? The manifest image isn't the original image. It has been molded by scientific practice to a certain extent. So it's our image of ourselves in everyday life, right? But our everyday life intuitions and conceptions of ourselves have, of course, been structured and challenged by scientific thinking. So the manifest image is our high-level everyday experience of ourselves and our place in the world, but in a scientific culture. The scientific image is, as the name suggests, the image of ourselves in the world that science gives us. And what's notable about Sellars and the scientific image is that he thinks that the scientific image does not contain things like persons, right? So the manifest image, one of its core constituents is the notion of a person, and in the scientific image there are no persons, although Sellars himself thinks that that's not, if you consider them correctly, there's not any sort of eliminativist worry about there are no real persons. And then he points towards this stereoscopic image, which I take the idea to be where you can sort of hold both in mind at once and see both the manifest and the scientific pictures as synthetically united in some way. So that's like basically Sellars and his four images in Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man. So why think that this sort of thing should be of interest to Marx or Marxist thought in general? Well, I think, look, I mean, it's clearly about difference between appearance and reality, and that's of perennial interest to basically all philosophers. And Marx, of course, has things to say about that. Not only at the level of, I think, the natural world, but also, in fact, probably more obviously in the social world. For example, what he says in Capital regarding wages being the illusory image of the real relationship of exploitation. Understanding science and the limits of the sciences, I think, is an important point for Marx and Marxism. Understanding science, or Wissenschaft and Naturwissenschaft, right, the sciences in general and the natural sciences, I think is important for Marx. Understanding how they can fit together with our ordinary pictures of the world, which is very much the Sellarsian project. And I think, my hope anyway, is that the Sellarsian conceptual apparatus can help reconceive or conceive things in a way that hopefully avoids what some people call vulgar Marxism, which is usually thought to be this like mechanistic, reductivist kind of Marxism where you know, there are no important features at any other level than the economic base, and the superstructure merely reflects the base and has no impact of its own, and so on. And I think, I mean, I'm pretty convinced that vulgar Marxism isn't Marx, might not even be Engels. Engels is a little bit more vulgar than Marx, but I don't want to blame Engels for too much. So I think it is worth avoiding that, because I think not only is it more faithful to the philosophers themselves, but also is just more plausible as a thought. Okay, so yeah, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't notice. Is it this one?
Yes. I think just
admit all.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks, Carl. Good. So I think there are four issues here that would be at the forefront of any sort of Marxian reading of the manifest and scientific images. And those would be how to think about in terms of praxis, dialectics, ideology, and objectivity. Praxis and dialectics are a bit more closely related to each other, and ideology and objectivity have some close relations. And I think that if we're interested in thinking about the idea that there is a way of conceiving or perceiving the world which foregrounds things like personhood and moral relations or productive relations, and there's a way of perceiving or conceiving the world according to which what's foregrounded is the causality of nature, I think these are the kinds of issues that would come to the forefront. I'm not suggesting that they're the only issues, but they are the ones that I have decided to focus on. Okay, so I should say as well that my main texts for Marx are, basically the 1844 manuscripts will be the thing I, am building on the most. But there are also texts around that time, and I think, to be fair, later texts that could be adduced as well. So, if we were thinking about science and the scientific image of the world in a way that would be congenial to Marx, well, I think what would be first on the agenda, as it were, is that science is a kind of practice. It's a set of procedures and methods, most importantly a collective endeavor. Marx has this sort of, in the manuscripts there's this strange line where he says that even when I'm thinking scientifically, which is difficult to do among others, right? And I think there he must be thinking wissenschaftlich when he's thinking not as in doing science in a lab, but trying to think carefully, calmly, and coolly in a systematic way. But even then, right, as he points out, shortly after that, that is a social kind of activity as well, because it's thought, and what's thought, it's language, and what's language, it's social. So science is a kind of practice, it's a kind of social practice. There are rules to the game, right, to talk like a postmodernist, but those rules can be in question, and sometimes are in question, and sometimes the rules in question concern methodology, sometimes they concern what kinds of things should count as evidence, sometimes they concern whether there is such a science at all, right? Whether the science has been misconceived at its root, right? Think of pseudosciences like phrenology. So theory and practice, I think in a Marxist or a Marxian way of looking at this, you wouldn't think of theory and practice as somehow inherently split off and needing to be put back together. They're already together. The problem is when you get the, I don't know, stereotypical empiricist who wants to overemphasize and becomes the archetype of that great Hegelian sin of being one-sided. So it's not that they are inherently split off, but we need to avoid conceptions of what we're doing when we do science that makes it appear as if they are split off. So science, kind of theoretical, also a kind of activity. Okay, so I think here's the key, right? That I think Marx would say, partly because of this praxis point, the scientific image cannot tell us that there are really no persons. That is not the kind of thing it could tell us. Now, I'm not here going to make a claim about Sellars. I kind of think Sellars thought that the scientific image might tell us about what the world would look sort of depersonalized, and our personhood relations, ways of relating to one another as persons, carried didn't carry a lot of ontological weight. I'm not sure what to make of that, whether that's a sort of eliminativist account or not, but I think for Marx, it's very clear the scientific image cannot tell us that there are no persons. That would be one-sided. That would be the error of abstractionism. That would be the error of taking one thing and saying that is the most important thing and forgetting all of the other relations. So to put it this other way, right, the scientific image is one way of the manifest image being extended in a particularly novel, interesting way. But the scientific image cannot by itself tell us how to interpret the scientific image. So the scientific image might reveal certain things about the movements of atoms, the movements of forces. That's all grand, but the scientific image itself cannot then tell us how to interpret it, what to do with it. So that is to say, the point there is kind of like, I don't think Marx needs to pick a fight with the scientist. He doesn't need to say, I, as a philosopher, get to tell you, the scientist, that you're wrong about this. He does get to pick a fight with the scientist when the scientist is doing philosophy, when the scientist moves beyond their actual data or experiments and says, here's a set of data, and here is why that challenges this philosophical position. But now they're doing interpretive inquiry, they're doing philosophy. So I've got in mind here things like, you know, the endless amount of scientists that have claimed throughout the years to disprove free will, right? Now, I think for Marx, that's the kind of claim that goes beyond the scientific data and requires philosophical interpretation. So there's this wonderful set of passages in the manuscripts where he talks about human nature being shaped through history. Science relies on observation, but our observation capacities are themselves informed by human history. The five senses, as he says, are the result of all previous history. So science then gets put in the, has a place in the grand story of human history as an historicized kind of activity of refining, sharpening the senses, enabling them to reveal more and more of reality. I like this claim that he says, here, the senses have therefore become directly in their practice theoreticians. So I think his his point, right, is that in our practice, right, scientific practice, which involves our scientific practice, which involves observation, experimentation, replication, those are ways in which you extend our ordinary capacities from the manifest image in one direction. There is nothing in there necessarily that says that that direction is somehow superior to all others or gets to decide what exists. I should say there, because I've sort of hinted at it, there's that famous claim that Sellars makes that science is the measure of what is and of what is not. I'm unsure how to read that. It strikes me as the kind of claim that, like, it's either false or trivial. That's probably like ridiculously controversial, but like, I don't know how Marx would think about it, right? Like, if science is the measure of what is, if it's natural science alone, then like surely no, because there are such things as like productive relations, money relations, which are outside the boundary of natural science. If it's science in general, Wissenschaft, then like sure, but then we've basically said that human thought is the measure of what is, which is fine if you're Hegel, right? So there's a I don't know how to read it. I'll talk more in general about it. So talked a little bit about practice, moving on to dialectics. Okay, so interrelationship, I've talked a little bit about this so far. You know, they're interrelated. The scientific image is an extension of the manifest. The manifest can be informed by the scientific, right? They're not the same. That would be no problem if they were the same. But they can mutually impact one another. So as I said, right, this is a different way of putting the same point, that science should not or cannot fall into scientism, usually thought to be the sort of hard naturalism, the view that all there really are, as every empiricist has said, that's the refrain of empiricism, all there really is whatever the fundamental particles are. So it can't do that kind of thing, right? It's not the kind of thing that can do that because it is a practice of agents, and it cannot tell you that agents do not exist. That would be to one-sidedly appreciate the images. So, skipping down a little, there's this thought of the unity of nature, the unity of science, and usually as it's thought, this program of the unity of science, right, so there's this Putnam and Oppenheim paper from the 50s where they talk in general about this unity of science as a working hypothesis, as they put it, and the idea is that all sciences have laws that express relationships between phenomena, and in principle it's possible to show how all of those laws from those sciences can be reduced in certain ways to the most fundamental sciences, and that shows you how their sciences are unified. They're unified by sort of reduction. I'm personally of the opinion that Philip Kitcher and Jerry Fodor showed this to be a fool's errand. That is, that it's not possible to show that there is a reduction from the high-level sciences, as it were, to the lower-level sciences. And I think Marx, like, you know, I always read Marx as kind of non-reductivist about lots of things. His naturalism, maybe we would call it liberal naturalism or expansive naturalism, not sure. But he does think that there could be a unity of science, but for him it's the unity of the human sciences, as we would call them, and the natural sciences. It's the unity of things like literature, philosophy, art with natural science. So it's humanized natural science, or natural science fit for humans. Okay, I'll go on for maybe another 7 or 8 minutes. So moving on from praxis and dialectics to ideology. So ideology, in my reading of Marx, ideology is always a pejorative term. There is some dispute about this, as many of you will know, in literature on Marx. But as Marx goes, or Marx and Engels, I think ideology is always a pejorative. Ideology is bad. You can be more or less ideological. Malthus, they say, is basically wholly ideology. Smith, a little bit better. Ricardo, a bit better. But still, even Ricardo has some ideology. So ideology, what's that? Well, it's false thinking, but it's not just when you're wrong. It's when you're wrong because you've been misled by either class presupposition, you've been misled by ahistorical, non-scientific thinking, non-wissenschaftlich thinking. So scientific thinking or wissenschaftlich thinking, right? Science in the broad sense of just a systematic inquiry into the world, can combat ideology. Now, where does ideology live? Well, the obvious answer, I think, is the manifest image. But I think also it could be the case, and probably is the case, that the scientific image could be used ideologically, or maybe contains ideology, if you like. Now, what would be ideological there? Well, something like that there exist no persons. That would be kind of ahistorical. It would be looking at the world one-sidedly. It would be abstractionist. Those are hallmarks of ideology. Right? There are no persons. There are only really mental states, or there are only really the physical movements of the brain. Basically, I think the line here is that there just isn't a need to think of the world as split into sort of fundamentals and epiphenomena or mere appearances. And when you get down to the fundamentals, you've revealed those appearances to be illusory. Now, I mentioned one case where Marx does talk like that, which is the case of wages. They are the illusory agreement on top of or in place of the real relation of exploitation. But even there, I think Marx's claim isn't that like wages don't really exist, right? His claim is that wages are the bad form in which the real relationship appears. So they're real in the sense that sort of money is real, right? If we all, money is somehow dependent on agreement, right? It's a conventional object in some way, but it's real nonetheless. So wages, but they are bad or ideological forms of its appearance. Okay, so I like this remark. I now can't recall where he said it. I'm pretty sure it's in a letter to Engels. There's this wonderful little comment where he says, they're talking about Darwin's Origin of Species. They both read it. Engels is like effusive with praise, and Marx is a bit less so. And he remarks to Engels that Darwin's just a bit too English for him. And by this, when Marx calls people English, he's often got in mind basically that they're too crudely empiricistic, right? They're too Lockean or Berkeleyan or Humean. So in this case, his disagreement or his dislike of Darwin is, in a way, not really with Darwin himself, but with the idea of Darwinism, that natural selection, evolution by natural selection, can somehow explain the whole of human history and the whole of natural history on top of that. Marx thinks, as I read it, that, yeah, of course, it's good for natural history, no doubt, absolutely. you cannot unproblematically assume that it is going to explain in exactly the same way human history. Why? Because humans are agents. They have made themselves. We continually make ourselves. And although I don't think Marx would say that the evolutionary story has nothing to say about us and our social world, he would argue that the explanation for why the social world is the way it is going to be a social explanation, not an evolutionary one. Okay, I'll end with some very brief remarks about objectivity. So basically what I want to say here is that objectivity, I think, kind of regulative ideal, can be found in both the manifest and the scientific images. And basically that I'd really like some feedback on this, because I kind of struggle sometimes to see the issue. It goes in and out of focus for me. But I think what I would say here for Marx is that there's no necessary conflict between speaking from a perspective or taking a stance or taking a side and speaking objectively or truly, right? So objectivity doesn't mean impartiality, if you like, right? So I think Marx's view and Marx and Engels' view is that they take the stance or the side of the proletariat, but that allows them to reveal truths about the world, the social world, which would not be easily revealed from the bourgeois standpoint. That's a way of them, I think, saying how they can be at once taking a stance, taking a side, and talking truth. So where does this leave us then, this sort of very, very programmatic account? Well, I think it leaves us here, right, that, you know, we have an image that the sciences, the natural sciences give us of the fundamental levels of the world, and we have the image of ordinary life, and sure, sometimes ordinary life is mistaken. It's bourgeois, right, the wages example again. So scientific thinking can help combat ideology in all spheres, right? Scientific thinking of all kinds, right? Sustained, systematic thought about reality. But there's no need, right? For Marx, I think he would say there's no need for us to be worried that somehow the scientific image is going to show that we don't really exist, or that you're a mere fiction, or that somehow you're just a play of forces where there's nothing extra, right? I don't think he would say you don't need to worry about that. There's no need to think of the conflict. So in a way, Marx would say to Sellars, yes, we've got a stereoscopic image. Already, there is no problem. That's where I'm at the moment. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. I always wondered about this passage about the senses having become theoreticians immediately in their practice and on. And I don't think I understood, like, you said, like, it somehow illustrates your point, and your take on, like, the status of science as, like, in Marx. And I don't think I understood, like, your explanation of, like, why Marx, I find it mysterious why Marx says, like, the senses are theoreticians, as opposed to just saying they're theory late.
Yes, yeah.
That would be easy to understand.
Yeah.
Have to be quasi people.
Yes, yeah. No, you're right. It is puzzling why he says theoreticians as opposed to, like, theoretical tools, right? I think my point is that for Marx, the idea is that throughout, if you take the long view, the real view of human history, you find that the senses have been informed not only by presumably evolutionary theory, but also by human activity. They've been shaped and reshaped over time, and we have this sort of rich experience that is in a way a result of practice. So when he says they become theoreticians, it's like, I think he's thinking that the human eye, as it were, as opposed to the natural eye, has been able to, in a way, already contribute to the conceptualization of experience in more sophisticated ways than are just revealed by sensory stimulus. That's the kind of line I wanted to push. I wasn't, you know, I don't think I was clear about that. But that, if you push that point, I think it allows you to say that there's like more interesting ways in which to think about theory and practice going together than the sort of ahistorical scientistic view. Right? Does that help? Yeah, somewhat. Okay, so yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. A lot of very interesting ideas. I have a remark and a question, if I may. The remark is about the matter of Darwinism and the idea that ultimately the social world will be explained in social terms rather than evolutionistic. And that reminds me about a topic in the big debate between the left-wing Sellars and the right-wing Sellars. The idea, the problem of the naturalization of the space of reason. And there are two main ways to naturalize it. One is the way of Millikan. So you take a concept and define it evolutionistically. Mm-hmm. And the other way is, as far as I know, is mentioned by Rory, and he says, well, you do not have to naturalize concept by concept. You have to naturalize the whole space of reason, the possibility to entertain, to sustain a space of reason. Mm-hmm. So that corresponds to the two ways. You have to take the concept of milk and you try to reduce it by evolution, or you try to explain how we can sustain a space of reasons, and then you give a social explanation for the concept. So this is my remark, maybe useful, maybe not. And the question is this. It's about the idea that we may have already the scientific image. Forget about the scientific realism for a moment. The problem with the divide between the scientific image and the manifest image is that they have incompatible categories. So there's an argument named the grain argument, according to which Sellars try to show that you cannot have both categories. So you have, if you are in the manifest image, you have the notion of person, but you also have the notion of cause, you have, and so on and so forth. You cannot just extend those to the scientific image because we have different sorts of categories. So, in a sense, you can say that the manifest image is scientific. So there's a lot of science inside, but according to Sellars, you find a limit beyond which you have to switch categories. And that's the whole problem is there something like that?
Okay. Yeah. So just for the benefit of the Zoom, I'll.
Yes,
yeah. So yeah, for the benefit of the Zoom, I'll just repeat the question. So the question was basically, look, the issue that Sellars identifies isn't just that the categories of the manifest and scientific images are different, it's that they're mutually incompatible. And maybe, sure, there's a sense in which you could extend categories in the manifest image to get to the scientific image, but there is a limit where you have to say, beyond this point, there is no way to conceptualize, say, person in scientific image terms or concepts from the scientific image. And then the question was, you know, what would my account or Marx say there? And I think, like Marx's vision, right? Like if you lean on the vision that he gives of the human side and the natural science side coming ever closer together, right? His programmatic dream statement would be that in the end that would somehow vanish, and you would maybe have the scientific image notion right over here and the manifest image notion right over there, and you just have a continuum, right? You'd get rid of those limits. But of course, that's a program, not an argument. I think, I'm not sure. Obviously, I'll have to think more about it. Yeah, nothing comes to mind right now, so we'll have to think about it. But thanks for the question. I think there was a couple of points over here. Yeah.
Well, I think this follows on really. I just wanted to ask, to pick up on your final comment, why shouldn't we worry? So it sounded like some facets of society or the way we think about ourselves are going to turn out to be ideological, like wages. But you seem to think that wouldn't apply to, say, the category of personhood. And I just wonder why. Like, why think that those deep-seated views of ourselves are not open to the possibility of ideological, mistakes?
Yeah. So I think that's helpful because I think they are open to ideological mistakes, and I think Marx and Engels very clearly say that. For example, it's the classic bourgeois individualist who thinks we're all atoms and then somehow manage to engage in social reality when it actually really we're social all along, right? I think my point was that for Marx, I think categories like person are ineliminable, right? There is a core to what it is to be a person that can be discovered, reshaped, sort of partly a discovery, partly a creation, who knows, shaped and reshaped over time. That is ineliminable. And the reason why persons, for example, are ineliminable is because the science is itself an activity of persons. So the scientist can't, in their activity, claim to be revealing that there's no activity going on, right? It's that kind of like, if you like, a performative contradiction or a pragmatic contradiction. That's why I think, that was why I sort of harped on about practice a lot at the beginning, is because I think Marx would say that in order for there to be a properly human account of our life and all the activities and how we fit into the world, you cannot at the outset think that your activity is going to reveal that really there's no activities going on, right? So that's the one, for example, why persons are ineliminable, because they cannot, there's no analysis that can sustain the thought that I am not thinking now, and so on with persons.
Related to what you were just talking about there, something that struck me with regards to what you were talking about, I was thinking about the relationship both with Sellars and Marx in terms of the relationship between social production and reproduction and knowledge. And I was wondering if it's the case that the scientific image, would the scientific image be able to contain truths that are like not socially reproducible in some sense? Like, I think, like, to take an example, like you were saying, like, we can't really think the thought that, like, I'm not a person. So if that was, like, in some sense, we could say true in some philosophical account, then, like, would, in the thinking of, like, Sellars and Marx, do you think that those would be able to become objective, practically speaking, or is there some kind of categorical difference based on the possibility of the reproduction of knowledge?
I'll try and rephrase the question and see if this gets right. Carl, how much time do I have?
You've got 5 more minutes.
Okay, great. So I think, let me know if this is a fair read of your question. So I think you said, look, in the scientific image, let's say, as usually interpreted, it generates truths which undermine the manifest image or categories in the manifest image to quite a large degree. Then the question is, if those thoughts or those theories cannot be consistently or coherently believed and spread out as knowledge in the world, does that generate a problem? Is that the...
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so good. I think that's right. So one of the, I think the sort of hallmarks, if you like, of ideology is that ideology cannot be fully or consistently, as it were, reproduced without giving the game away, right? There's got to be something in it that's hidden. Otherwise it becomes unable to be believed and reproduced by people unless there's like a significant amount of self-deceit going on. So I think in those cases, it would be like that, right? It would be like that ideology where if you say like, oh, there's no persons or there's no consciousness, all there really is brain activity. It's like, I think it would be like the ideological case where what's going on is you're eliding a significant amount of the story there in order to make your claim sort of strike people. So you say all there really is brain activity. But that's abstractionist, right? That's taking one part and saying this is the most important part, but like, why have you done that? Okay, maybe there's something about predictive power and so on. But I think for Marx, that would be the line that he would take. Thanks. I think there's time for one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for an excellent talk and for raising so many issues that are absolutely worth getting into in the next few days. What about, so I'm with you. I think I could completely agree. I think I see the tension between Marx and Sellars, but I wanted to push a line that I don't agree with to see what you might think of it. I haven't figured this out, but what about a Carnapian reading of Sellars, where it's a socialist project, let's say, and there's a recognition that all of our categories, or uses of categories, the way we carve up the world in the manifest image are hopelessly distorted through centuries of living through capitalism and other forms of exploitation. We're lost, and there's no way we're going to gain freedom. What we need to do is abandon them as much as possible. Think of the radical nature of the Cars lectures and what science becomes, where what we're pursuing in science is tracking patterns and predicting them, and get rid of everything else, as the guy over there said. Like, forget about causality, forget about all these other things that are still part of science. Embracing an image like that will set us free from all of the mess that we've inherited through capitalism. And then personhood remains a part of it. We will continue fundamentally to treat one another as persons, as agents with rights and duties, and to form a community capable of pursuing science in that way. What does a Marxist want to say to a reading like that?
Yeah, good. So for the benefit of the Zoom, Yeah. So for the benefit of the Zoom, I'll just repeat what I took to be the question. So the idea is, look, why couldn't the idea be like this, that the manifest image is so fundamentally distorted or has distorted categories in it to such a degree that rather than trying to like keep them or reshape them or tinker with them, it requires just radical revolution, getting rid of pretty much all of them, maybe most of them. Why isn't that the picture? And I think the picture is not that, because I think Marx, whilst of course there's a great degree of distortion introduced into the categories of ordinary life through bad thinking, through inability to reconceive, through just like sheer ignorance, I think he would want to say that to some degree those categories have that, there's a sort of essence, if you like, that can be sublated, rethought, and come to a more truer version of themselves. So it's not a radical break where you get rid of all of them. It's the historical process of coming to see ever more clearly what's really important about each of the concepts or each of the categories or each of our modes of living. So it's a more gradual process. That doesn't mean there's never going to be sort of radical breaks, but it's a more gradual process where the categories get sublated over time. I think that's the line I wanted to argue. Okay, well, I think I'm out of time, so
Yes.
thanks very much, everybody.